Okay, getting back to the introduction, I don't want to get too much farther. There is another chart, a political chart, but I feel like we're going to get bogged down in too many details that will derail us from where we were at in the introduction, which is to say that where we left off was we read the preface and then the introduction, subsections 1 and 2. So we left off with subsection 3, in which he begins to get more into the metaphysics of these societies and the difference between historic cultures and ahistoric cultures, which is a key distinction that Spengler makes here. He says, thus our theme, which originally comprised only the limited problem of present-day civilization, broadens itself into a new philosophy, the philosophy of the future, so far as the metaphysically exhausted soil of the West can bear such, and in any case, the only philosophy which is within the possibilities of the West European mind in its next stages. It expands into the conception of a morphology of world history, of the world as history in contrast to the morphology of the world as nature, that hitherto has been almost the only theme of philosophy, and it reviews once again the forms and movements of the world and their depths and final significance, but this time according to an entirely different ordering which groups them not in an ensemble picture inclusive of everything known, but in a picture of life, and presents them not as things become, but as things becoming. The world as history, conceived, viewed, and given form from out of its opposite, the world as nature, here is a new aspect of human existence on this earth. And so what he's doing here is he's taken from that first crucial paragraph of subsection 2, where he's talking about the means to identify dead forms as mathematical law. That now becomes the world as nature, the scientific priesthood. It's a significant fact that many of the great thinkers in the West, in Faustian civilization, began as monks and priests, as we'll see. And then the means whereby to understand living forms is analogy, morphological analogy, which now becomes the world as history. And so the one becomes associated with space. World as nature is space. World as history is time. So he's taking space and time and showing that there are these two kinds of different mentalities of intellectualism, one being intellect proper, but the other being a type of intellect that, like Goethe's or Leonardo's, understands the morphological processes of the unfolding of history. Later on he'll say that the difference between Darwin and Goethe, let's say Darwin's understanding of the evolution of species, is that Darwin's always looking for a cause somewhere. There has to be a cause, and so the cause for him becomes natural selection, which is an external factor that puts pressure on random mutations. And the random mutations that are just constantly being spit out are acted upon by natural selection, which then edits them out. And so there's a causality. That's a world as nature version of with the law of causality, which is also going to be slot in here, the causality principle, as he'll call it. Versus Goethe's view of nature, he says there's not a word of causality in it. Goethe simply apprehends the unfolding and flowering and formation and transformation of the forms. Everything is a metamorphosis, a process of metamorphosis that has nothing whatsoever to do with causality, and that will become later, Spengler will call that the destiny idea. Destiny unfolds. It's something that will happen. Causality always needs a reason. So there are two different types of ways of approaching the world through these two different types of intellect. As yet, in spite of its immense significance, both practical and theoretical, this aspect has not been realized, still less presented. Some obscure inkling of it there may have been, a distant momentary glimpse there has often been, but no one has deliberately faced it and taken it in with all its implications. We have before us two possible ways in which man may inwardly possess and experience the world around him. With all rigor, I distinguish, as to form, not substance, the organic from the mechanical world impression, the content of images from that of laws, the picture and symbol from the formula and the system. So there's the picture and the symbol, as opposed to formula and system. Images is the world as history. Images, laws, is the world as nature. The instantly actual from the constantly possible. The intents and purposes of imagination ordering according to plan, from the intents and purposes of experience dissecting according to scheme. And, to mention even thus early, an opposition that has never yet been noted, in spite of its significance, the domain of chronological from that of mathematical number. Mathematical number is, of course, the world as nature. Chronological number unfolds through time, and that's the world as history. Consequently, in a research such as that lying here before us, there can be no question of taking spiritual political events as they become visible day by day on the surface at their face value, and arranging them on a scheme of causes or effects, and following them up in the obvious and intellectually easy directions. Such a pragmatic handling of history would be nothing but a piece of natural science in disguise, and for their part, the supporters of the materialistic idea of history make no secret about it. It is their adversaries who largely fail to see the similarity of the two methods. What concerns us is not what the historical facts which appear at this or that time are per se, but what they signify, what they point to by appearing. Present-day historians think they are doing a work of supererogation in bringing in religious and social, or still more art history details to illustrate the political sense of an epoch. But the decisive factor, decisive that is insofar as visible history is the expression, sign, and embodiment of soul, they forget. I have not hitherto found one who has carefully considered the morphological relationship that inwardly binds together the expression forms of all branches of a culture, who has gone beyond politics to grasp the ultimate and fundamental ideas of Greeks, Arabians, Indians, and Westerners in mathematics, the meaning of their early ornamentation, the basic forms of their architecture, philosophies, dramas, and lyrics, their choice and development of great arts, the detail of their craftsmanship and choice of materials, let alone appreciated the decisive importance of these matters for the form problems of history, because this idea is that everything within a civilization is an expression of the same basic, what he calls a prime symbol. And the idea of the prime symbol comes from Goethe, with his idea that the prime symbol of the Erbpflanze is the leaf. The leaf is the archetype of which every single aspect of every plant is but a transformation. Take an orange, open it, and what you see in there is a transformed leaf. The leaf is the basic archetype. It's the prime symbol of which every single aspect of the plant is an expression. So Spengler's going to say likewise, and what he's talking about here by phenomena as they appear signify something inward, they point back to the prime symbol of each culture. Each culture has a different prime symbol, of which every single aspect of that culture is somehow a manifestation. The prime symbol of classical civilization is the body, the beautiful physical human body, which is manifested whether we're talking about Greek tragedy, or whether we're talking about their theory of atoms, or whether we're talking about their various epistemologies, or even their primary art form, which is indeed sculpture of the human body. It all points back to the sensuous, concrete, what he calls Apollonian form. That's the prime symbol. That is the symbol, of which every single aspect of that civilization is a manifestation. Same thing with the Arabian civilization. Everything there is a manifestation of the world as cave, the world as cavern, within which magical forces battle in a war of light against darkness with mysterious substances, of which alchemy is a transformation, algebra is a transformation with its mysterious XYZ properties. Everything in that culture is a manifestation of the prime symbol of the cave, the world as cavern. With respect to our Faustian civilization, everything in our civilization is a manifestation of infinite space. Infinite space and infinity in general, infinity in time as well as space, is what everything is a manifestation of. From our Gothic cathedrals, you walk into one of those cathedrals, you look up and you go, these are the people who are going to go to the moon. This is their mentality. This is the infinite expansion, infinitesimal calculus. The vanishing point in the depth perspective of painting, that vanishing point never ends. It goes on to infinity. So each one of these cultures has a different prime symbol that it is expressing. So he'll get more into these prime symbols in a bit here. But that's what he's getting at here. That which unifies all the phenomena of a culture. Who amongst them realizes that between the differential calculus and the dynastic principle of politics in the age of Louis XIV, between the classical city-state and the Euclidean geometry, between the space perspective of Western oil painting and the conquest of space by railroad, telephone, and long-range weapon, between contrapuntal music and credit economics, there are deep uniformities. Yet, viewed from this morphological standpoint, even the humdrum facts of politics assume a symbolic and even a metaphysical character, and, what has perhaps been impossible hitherto, things such as the Egyptian administrative system, the classical coinage, analytical geometry, the check, the Suez Canal, the book printing of the Chinese, the Prussian army, and the Roman road engineering can, as symbols, be made uniformly understandable and appreciable by this principle of the prime symbol, the Ursymbole. But at once, the fact presents itself that as yet there exists no theory-enlightened art of historical treatment. What passes as such draws its methods almost exclusively from the domain of that science which alone has completely disciplined the methods of cognition, viz. Physics. And thus we imagine ourselves to be carrying on historical research when we are really following out objective connections of cause and effect. It is a remarkable fact that the old-fashioned philosophy never imagined even the possibility of there being any other relation than this between the conscious human understanding and the world outside. Kant, who in his main work established the formal rules of cognition, took nature only as the object of reason's activity, and neither he himself nor anyone after him noted the reservation. Knowledge for Kant is mathematical knowledge. He's on the side of the world as nature, one of the priesthood of science, who sees knowledge as mathematical knowledge. Knowledge of nature always somehow is mathematical for Kant. It always comes back to the a priori categories of cognition. Never has anything to do with destiny, time, chronology, or unfolding. He deals with innate intuition forms and categories of the reason, but he never thinks of the wholly different mechanism by which historical impressions are apprehended. And Schopenhauer, who significantly enough retains but one of the Kantian categories, viz. Causality, speaks contemptuously of history. I guess Schopenhauer is another one of these priesthood of thinkers of the world as nature. He does shave off all the Kantian categories, quantity, quality, relation, and modality, and from relation takes only the category of causality, junks the rest, and says this is all superfluous baggage. Schopenhauer makes a mistake here, though. I think it's worth taking a moment to compare Kant and Schopenhauer. So he flushes all of that, and he says the only category that matters is causality, and also the forms of intuition, space and time, which are innate to the human brain somehow in Kant. Space, time, and causality are what the human mind a priori brings with it to experience, so that when we're walking around having experiences, we can understand what causes what. That the lightning that just flashed is the cause now of the thunder that's rumbling. Okay, so there's that. And then he also changes Verstand and Vernunft. We had said before that Verstand, the understanding, has to do with the categories of cognition, whereas Vernunft has to do with reason that goes in quest of the metaphysical ideas that unify the physical world. Schopenhauer says, no. All you need is Verstand is the category that produces in the human being the understanding, and Vernunft is what produces language. So Verstand is part of space-time and causality. Vernunft is just the category that allows human beings to abstract concepts so that they can think abstractly. But I don't think Schopenhauer quite understood Kant. What Kant was actually saying is not so much that we have these categories as we walk down the street so that we can make sense out of things around us, as that he was saying, these are the categories that science presupposes in order for any object that it studies to be scientific, per se. That's a different thing than saying that you're walking around the street understanding things that are happening around you. Schopenhauer is talking about average everyday experience. Kant is not. Kant is talking about here is the metaphysical object, which Heidegger would call a de-worlded object put into the mode of Vorhandenheit, which is an object that science de-worlds by putting it into a Cartesian phase space with an XYZ axis. That's the thing Kant is talking about. That in order to make sense out of that object as a scientific entity, we do need these categories. And he was absolutely correct. You cannot have a scientific object without these kinds of objective qualities. He wasn't just talking about walking around, having an experience. So I think Schopenhauer misunderstood Kant, actually. But they're making two different points. And so he says here that there is, besides a necessity of cause and effect, which I may call the logic of space, another necessity, an organic necessity in life, that of destiny. The logic of time is a fact of the deepest inward certainty, a fact which suffuses the whole of mythological religions and artistic thought and constitutes the essence and kernel of all history, in contradistinction to nature, but is unapproachable through the cognition forms which the critique of pure reason investigates. This fact still awaits its theoretical formulation. And what will happen later is that Spengler will come up with this idea that every civilization not only has a different Ursymbole, a different primary symbol, but a different understanding of destiny. Each one has its own understanding of causality, but the destiny idea is a different thing. The Greeks have the primary destiny idea that they have is that, and it's always worked out through works of art, especially tragedy, the destiny idea for the Greeks is Moira. Moira is something to which even Zeus is subordinate. Moira has to do with boundaries, so it has a very specific spatial sensuous aspect to it, and anything bad that happens to a Greek character is because of a transgression against Moira, and then nemesis befalls him. In the Arabian world, the primary destiny idea is Kismet. Kismet is an Arabian idea. Job is the classic example of this, the book of Job. Even though it's a Jewish text, it doesn't matter. It's part of the same culture. Kismet comes from God. God is not subordinate to fate. Fate comes from God. We pray to God to change things for us. Everything comes from God. Job must submit to God. That's the destiny idea in the Arabian civilization. In the Faustian civilization, the destiny idea is Weird, W-Y-R-D, like the Weird Sisters in Macbeth, which first appears in the Beowulf epic. Beowulf goes out to meet his Weird and fight the dragon, which kills him. Weird comes from within. In the Western civilization, it comes from the I, from the ego. It's part of the mysterious process of what Jung will later call Menschwerdung, the individuation process that destiny unfolds from within. It doesn't come from without. It doesn't come from God. It doesn't come from the gods. It comes from you as a metaphysical entity. So each civilization will have its own destiny idea, by way of which is usually worked out in its novels and plays and stories and such. As Galileo says in a famous passage of the Saggiatore, philosophy, as nature's great book, is written in mathematical language. We await today the philosopher who will tell us in what language history is written and how it is to be read. Mathematics and the principle of causality lead to a naturalistic chronology, and the idea of destiny lead to a naturalistic chronology and the idea of destiny to a historical ordering of the phenomenal world. Both orderings, each on its own account, cover the whole world. The difference is only in the eyes by which and through which this world is realized. Subsection 4, then, is a bit long. Let's see, we're at the 19-minute mark. Okay, let's go ahead and do it. Nature is the shape in which the man of higher cultures synthesizes and interprets the immediate impressions of his senses. History is that from which his imagination seeks comprehension of the living existence of the world in relation to his own life, which he thereby invests with a deeper reality. Whether he is capable of creating these shapes, which of them it is that dominates his waking consciousness, is a primordial problem of all human existence. Man thus has before him two possibilities of world formation. But it must be noted at the very outset that these possibilities are not necessarily actualities, and if we are to inquire into the sense of all history, we must begin by solving a question which has never yet been put, viz., for whom is there history? The question is seemingly paradoxical, for history is obviously for everyone to this extent that every man, with his whole existence and consciousness, is a part of history. But it makes a great difference whether anyone lives under the constant impression that his life is an element in a far wider life course that goes on for hundreds and thousands of years, or conceives of himself as something rounded off and self-contained. For the latter type of consciousness, there is certainly no world history, no world as history. But how if the self-consciousness of a whole nation, how if a whole culture rests on this ahistoric spirit? How must actuality appear to it? The world, life. Consider the classical culture. Okay, so now he's moving into a distinction of this idea that certain cultures are historical, certain cultures are ahistorical. So we have yet another type of distinction between civilizations. I love how he lines all these up with all these different species of civilization. And he's going to say that the Greeks and the Romans, the classical civilization, is ahistoric. It had very little awareness of historical becoming. And also the Hindus, even more so, is an ahistoric civilization. The primary symbol of the Hindu civilization is the world as dream. As far as I know, the Hindus never produced a single historian. Maybe one, I think, a guy named Kalanos, who wrote a history of Kashmir. I think that's it. They never produced any historians. And the classical civilization produced historians, but as Spengler's going to point out, they always write about the events that they participated in their own day, that they themselves participated in. Anything before the time the writer lived is thrown into the junk heap of myth. The Egyptian civilization, on the other hand, is intensely historical. We know the name of every pharaoh. They kept records of every single pharaoh, everything that ever happened. We know Egyptian history in detail and intensely. Same thing with Chinese history, which was also a historic civilization. And of course, the Faustian civilization is the historic civilization par excellence, gone to the point where we want to know the history of the entire planet. So here, that's what he's going to say here. Consider the classical culture. In the world consciousness of the Hellenes, all experience, not merely the personal, but the common past, was immediately transmuted into a timeless, immobile, mythically fashioned background for the particular momentary present. Thus the history of Alexander the Great began, even before his death, to be merged by classical sentiment in the Dionysus legend, and to Caesar there seemed at the least nothing preposterous in claiming descent from Venus. Such a spiritual condition, it is practically impossible for us men of the West, with a sense of time distances so strong that we habitually and unquestioningly speak of so many years before or after Christ to reproduce in ourselves. But we are not on that account entitled, in dealing with the problems of history, simply to ignore the fact. What diaries and autobiographies yield, this is interesting, something just clicked in my mind, which the West, we do all kinds of autobiographies in the West. I just wrote one recently. But the only other civilization that wrote autobiographies were the Egyptians. In fact, they invented the genre, another historical civilization. The autobiography initiated in the 4th dynasty from tomb inscriptions of the of the nobles. They would write tomb inscriptions and give little life histories of the various great deeds that each one of them did. So an autobiography is produced by a culture with a historic mentality. So what diaries and autobiographies yield in respect of an individual, that historical research in the widest and most inclusive sense, that is, every kind of psychological comparison and analysis of alien peoples, times, and customs, yields as to the soul of a culture as a whole. But the classical culture possessed no memory, no organ of history in this special sense. The memory of the classical man, so to call it, though it is somewhat arbitrary, to apply to alien souls a notion derived from our own, is something different, since past and future, as arraying perspectives in the working consciousness, are absent, and the pure present, which so often roused Goethe's admiration, every product of the classical life, and in sculpture particularly, fills that life with an intensity that to us is perfectly unknown. This pure present, whose greatest symbol is the Doric column, is itself, in itself predicates the negation of time, of direction. For Herodotus and Sophocles, as for Themistocles or a Roman consul, the past is subtilized instantly into an impression that is timeless and changeless, polar and not periodic in structure, in the last analysis of such stuff as myths are made of, whereas for our world sense and our inner eye, the past is a definitely periodic and purposeful organism of centuries or millennia. There is indeed nothing in Western civilization that does not have a past. Nothing shows up in what Heidegger would call the clearing, the Lichtung, where encounters with entities are made evident, that does not have a past and is not assumed to have a past. Not so for the classical civilization. But it's just this background which gives the life, whether it be the classical or the Western life, its special coloring. What the Greeks called cosmos was the image of a world that is not continuous but complete. Inevitably, then, the Greek man himself was not a series but a term. For this reason, although classical man was well acquainted with the strict chronology and almanac reckoning of the Babylonians, and especially the Egyptians, and therefore with that eternity sense and disregard of the present as such, which revealed itself in their broadly conceived operations of astronomy and their exact measurements of big time intervals, none of this ever became intimately a part of him. What his philosophers occasionally told him on the subject they had heard, not experienced, and what a few brilliant minds in the Asiatic Greek cities, such as Hipparchus and Aristarchus, discovered, was rejected alike by the Stoic and by the Aristotelian, and outside a small professional circle not even noticed. Neither Plato nor Aristotle had an observatory. In the last years of Pericles, the Athenian people passed a decree by which all who propagated astronomical theories were made liable to impeachment. This last was an act of the deepest symbolic significance, expressive of the determination of the classical soul to banish distance in every aspect from its world consciousness. As regards classical history writing, take Thucydides. The mastery of this man lies in his truly classical power of making alive and self-explanatory the events of the present, and also in his possession of the magnificently practical outlook of the born statesman who has himself been both general and administrator. In virtue of this quality of experience, which we unfortunately confuse with the historical sense proper, his work confronts the merely learned and professional historian as an inimitable model, and quite rightly so. But what is absolutely hidden from Thucydides is perspective, the power of surveying the history of centuries, that which for us is implicit in the very conception of a historian. The fine pieces of classical history writing are invariably those which set forth matters within the political present of the writer, whereas for us it is the direct opposite, our historical masterpieces without exception being those which deal with a distant past. Thucydides would have broken down in handling even the Persian Wars, let alone the general history of Greece, while that of Egypt would have been utterly out of his reach. He, as well as Polybius and Tacitus, who like him were practical politicians, loses his sureness of eye from the moment when, in looking backwards, he encounters motive forces in any form that is unknown in his practical experience. For Polybius, even the First Punic War, for Tacitus, even the reign of Augustus, are inexplicable. As for Thucydides, his lack of historical feeling, in our sense of the phrase, is conclusively demonstrated on the very first page of his book by the astounding statement that before his time, about 400 BC, no events of importance had occurred in the world. I'm going to leave it here a bit. My throat's getting a bit hoarse, but we'll stop there and pick up on page, looks like we're on page 10 in the next one.